This is The Big Breakdown, a long look back at some of the biggest stories we're covering for you at the Hidden Killers podcast and True Crime Today. This is Hidden Killers with Tony Bruschi. Here now, Tony Bruschi.
There is a certain kind of panic that tends to only show up when the truth is about to come out, or a version of it. Not the truth someone crafted, not the version they rehearsed, but the truth they lived. And when we're watching something like this unravel, you never know exactly what may be about to come out. What we're talking about is the new Sean Diddy Combs documentary. And what we're watching right now in that new Sean Diddy Combs documentary is the panic in its purest form. Because for decades, Diddy controlled every frame, every story, every beat of the mythology surrounding him. And now for the first time, someone else has the footage. We're going to see him trying to control that mythology in real time, on camera, as someone else tells the story. And he's reacting like a man watching the walls of a private world collapse in slow motion from behind bars. You may have seen some of his reactions to it, calling it illegal, calling it unethical, calling it this, calling it that. The new Netflix documentary, Sean Combs: The Reckoning, is not just another celebrity takedown piece. It's not a rehash of headlines. It's not a remix of old rumors. It's something far more dangerous to a man like Diddy. It's structured, documented, multi-voice portrait of a pattern, a long arc of alleged behavior that insiders, former friends, former employees, artists, accusers, and yes, even the people within the music industry have been talking about quietly for decades. The doc isn't breaking news. It's breaking more silence. When Fitty Cent first started teasing this project, people thought he was trolling. People thought it was another layer in the long-running feud. But the more he talked, the clearer it became. This wasn't about rivalry. This was about exposure. This was about finally dragging into the light a version of Diddy that a lot of people in the industry allegedly saw, allegedly dealt with, and allegedly survived, but never felt safe talking about. Not until now. Not after the lawsuits, not after the federal charges, not after the Cassie footage, not after the entire empire started cracking from the inside. And let's be honest, Fitty Cent didn't need to make this documentary. He didn't need to insert himself into the downfall of a man he's mocked for years. He didn't need to bring in a director with real credentials, a network with global reach, or a team willing to go after footage Diddy believed he could lock away forever. But he did. And in every interview that he's given thus far, the GMA sit-down, the press tours, the Instagram lives, he keeps saying the same thing. He did this to himself. All we're doing is showing it. That's the part that really kind of just reaches through all of this outrage that we're seeing from Diddy. Fitty Cent isn't claiming to expose anything the world didn't know. He's claiming to expose what the world refused to deal with. Because Diddy was powerful, because the industry protected him, because the brand was too big, because people looked the other way. This documentary is the one thing Diddy didn't really expect to see in a Diddy documentary. A mirror. And what the mirror shows is a pattern of control, a pattern of intimidation, a pattern of chaos disguised as glamour, a pattern of alleged violence cushioned by wealth, fame, and loyalty he didn't earn. Loyalty he bought, loyalty he demanded, loyalty he enforced, allegedly, through fear. According to Fitty Cent, the documentary includes people who were in the rooms where Diddy's world wasn't glamorous. The rooms where the screaming happened, where the threats allegedly happened, where the coercion allegedly happened, where the parties allegedly went from wild nightlife to something else entirely. He says these aren't just accusers from lawsuits. These are the insiders, security, assistants, industry, staff, artists, collaborators, people who allegedly had to clean up messes, smooth over incidents, handle payouts, and hush crises, and coordinate the elaborate machinery surrounding a man who for decades believed he was untouchable. And you can hear it in the way Fitty Cent talks about him. This isn't a man who slipped once or twice. This is a man who allegedly built an entire ecosystem around secrecy. An ecosystem where money moved quietly. People disappeared quietly. Problems resolved quietly. He describes it as a machine, one designed to protect Diddy no matter who allegedly got hurt in the process. He also keeps pointing out something crucial. Everyone knew. The industry allegedly knew. The insiders allegedly knew. The people at the label allegedly knew. The producers allegedly knew. The staff allegedly knew. And for years, nobody said a word publicly because the power was that intense. Because Diddy's alleged rage was provoked, and when provoked was allegedly legendary because people allegedly feared retaliation, career destruction, or worse. So they stayed silent. Until now. And that's what makes this documentary different from everything else that we've seen about Diddy. It's not just the accusers talking, it's the ecosystem unraveling. One of the biggest revelations Fitty Cent has hinted at is the psychological side of Diddy's need to film everything. Not the polished videos, not the music videos, not the behind-the-scenes clips he wanted the world to see, but the private archive. The footage he shot of himself. For himself, long before social media turned everyone into a cameraman. According to the director, Diddy filmed everything. He documented his life obsessively, and he allegedly believed that made him powerful because he controlled the camera, he controlled the angles, he controlled the footage, he controlled how he would be remembered. And that footage, according to Netflix, is now part of the documentary. And that's the part Diddy really doesn't like. It's the part he's speaking about from prison. The part he's calling stolen. That's the part he's trying to discredit before the world can see it. Because if you believe Fitty Cent, the footage is not bad, not illegal, bad, but revealing bad, human bad, ego bad, rage bad, panic bad, the kind of bad that collapses, a mythology in seconds. He's talked about the footage that allegedly shows Diddy spiraling before his arrest, not just angry and frantic. Not just stressed, but unglued. Not just emotional, but paranoid. The kind of panic that suggests a man who knows the truth is finally catching up to him, no matter how fast he runs. That 6-day window, the one Netflix has teased in the trailer, may be the most important piece of the entire doc, because it's not about guilt or innocence, it's about exposure. The mask slipping, the confidence cracking, the empire trembling. There's a line in that clip that tells you everything. We are losing. Not we have a plan, not we'll fight this, but we are losing. That's the voice of a man who suddenly realizes the narrative is no longer in his hands. And then there's the broader pattern, the one the documentary allegedly lays out step by step through voices spanning decades. The bad boy era, the Puff Daddy era, the Diddy era, the Love era, the rebrands, the transformations, the new personas, the constant evolution designed to bury the past under endless layers of reinvention. 50 Cent has said repeatedly that the rebrands weren't artistic. They were strategic. They were ways to create distance, to create confusion, to create smoke, to make the timeline messy enough that allegations blurred into old rumors, lawsuits blurred into accusations, and everything that made Diddy look bad got lost in the shuffle of the next big party, the next big deal, the next high-profile relationship, the next way of saying Diddy. Or as we like to say here now, dipshitty. The documentary, according to insiders, maps the timeline cleanly. No distractions, no rebrands, no myth-making, just the arc, the rise, the power, the behavior, and the fallout. 50 Cent has talked about the rooms that that seems to be the word he's using a lot of. I'll say that. People are going to talk about the rooms. He said in one interview, the rooms where things allegedly happened that nobody wanted to speak about. Rooms where guests allegedly surrendered their phones. Rooms where rules allegedly changed. And rooms where boundaries allegedly disappeared. Rooms where people claimed they felt trapped or scared or violated. These rooms, he says, were legendary, but never in a good way. And the doc allegedly features people who were in those rooms. Then there's the violence, the alleged violence that people in the industry whispered about but never confronted directly. The doc reportedly covers the Cassie video, the one Diddy publicly apologized for once he got caught. But it goes further. It reportedly includes people who claim his rage was not an isolated incident. People who claim they witnessed physical outbursts, screaming matches, smashed objects, threats. Again, allegations, but not new ones, old ones being pulled into the light side by side for the first time. The documentary allegedly drills into the psychological pattern, the charm, the generosity, the seduction followed by the control, the rage, the punishment, the cycle repeated again and again. Fitty Cent talked about this specifically, that the charm, again, wasn't accidental, it was intentional. And the rage wasn't random, it was strategic. And people stayed because the quieter moments, the gifts, the praise, the opportunities felt like safety. Until they weren't. The doc reportedly includes people who say they were groomed into that cycle, people who say they were exploited, people who say they were coerced, people who say they saw others go through it, and others who say they dealt with the aftermath, the bruises, the panic, the cover-ups. What Fitty Cent keeps emphasizing is that the pattern never stopped. He says the behavior people witnessed and whispered about in the 90s allegedly continued into the 2000s, the 10s, the 20s. The fame didn't humble him, it fueled him. The power didn't restrain him, it expanded the perimeter of what he could allegedly get away with. And the doc apparently draws a straight line through all of it. He's hinted that the documentary includes people who were terrified for years but finally feel protected enough to speak because Diddy is no longer powerful enough to silence them, not with money, not with lawyers, not with influence. And then there's the federal piece. Well, the doc isn't a legal analysis. It reportedly uses the federal investigation as a spine, not to re-prosecute him, but to contextualize the allegations, to show how the civil lawsuits align with what prosecutors described, to show how the accusations overlap, to show how the behavior listed in indictments reflects testimony from insiders. Again, not proof, pattern. And that's the thing Diddy's terrified of, a pattern. An isolated accusation can be explained away. A pattern, not so much. A civil lawsuit can be dismissed as opportunistic. A pattern cannot. A single video can be framed as a moment of weakness. A pattern cannot. And the documentary is a pattern. That's why Diddy is screaming about stolen footage, because the footage kills the myth, because the footage doesn't care about branding, because the footage doesn't lie to protect him. In some interviews, Fitty Cent has said the footage is worse than people expect. Not because it shows crimes, but because it shows truth. A truth that contradicts the persona. A truth that makes the allegations feel less like isolated claims and more like pieces of a larger psychological portrait. He said the doc is bigger than beef, bigger than entertainment, bigger than revenge. He said it's about people who finally get to tell what really happened. And that's why Diddy is scared. Because when a man like Diddy loses control of the story, truly loses it, the whole empire shakes, the money shakes, the relationship shakes, the brand shakes, the legacy shakes. The fan who once defended him start asking questions. The collaborators start distancing themselves. The executives go quiet. The loyalty dissolves, and the truth, or something close to it, starts leaking everywhere. This documentary is another leak in a ship that seems like, hasn't that already sunk? It keeps bobbing to the surface. It's back again. What's going on? Quick, call Fitty. The long-avoided confrontation, the cracks filled in. The timeline cleaned up, the voices aligned, the cameras turned around. Diddy is not watching his career unravel. He's watching his myth unravel. The version of himself he curated for decades, charismatic, visionary, unstoppable, is being confronted by the version people say they saw in the shadows. Controlling, volatile, manipulative, allegedly violent, allegedly exploitative, and allegedly dangerous. The documentary doesn't claim to convict him, it claims to expose him. Expose the rooms, expose the rage, expose the power dynamics, expose the people who stayed silent, expose the man behind the persona, and expose the pattern. And that's why he's screaming and threatening and accusing and panicking. Because once this documentary is seen, once the footage rolls, once the insiders speak, once the pattern is laid out cleanly, Diddy doesn't get to hide behind branding anymore. He doesn't get to call himself love and erase everything that came before. He doesn't get to say, well, see, they didn't find me guilty of this or that, so none of it can be true. He doesn't get to rely on the industry to protect him. And for the first time in his life, Diddy doesn't get final cut. Have you seen it yet? It is out. If you are, depending when you're watching this, the drop date of it is December 2nd of 2025. So if you're like, is it out? It's out. I'm curious to get your thoughts on it in the comments section on YouTube. If you're not already there, search Hidden Killers with Tony Bruschi. That's where you'll find us. And give us your thoughts. I'd love to hear them. It's going to be an interesting one. I think probably the most anticipated doc about all this in quite some time. Hey, while you're there on YouTube, hit subscribe so you don't miss any of our coverage of this and the many cases that we follow for you right here. We do greatly appreciate that. Until next time, I am Tony Bruschi. We'll talk again.
Want more on this case and others? Then press subscribe now and don't miss a moment of true crime coverage from Tony Bruschi and the Hidden Killers podcast. This is Hidden Killers with Tony Bruschi. Here now, Tony Bruschi.
Here's a case that if you've been around long enough, you may have been paying attention to since 1996. Yeah, to all the OGs out there, this is an interesting story. There are new revelations that are coming out of the new Fitty Cent Jackson documentary about Diddy that has dropped on Netflix, and they are accusations at that. There's some very interesting testimony that is being shared in this documentary, and take it for what it is. Diddy has never been charged with anything in connection with the murders of Tupac Shakur or Biggie Smalls. We'll say that off the bat. But the theories, the opinions expressed within that docuseries, they're worth noting. They're some of the most damning, most critical, most revealing about the inner workings of Bad Boy Records and Bad Boy Entertainment at the time of the murders of both Tupac and Biggie Smalls, with a lot of fingers and a lot of accusations pointing in a direction of one man. That man, Sean Puffy Diddy Combs. And we're not here to say he had anything to do with the murders. We're going to discuss, though, what was revealed in this docu-series, because it certainly is rather interesting. Something that probably deserves a little more digging, a little more discussion, a little more in terms of, I don't know, at some point, evidentiary hearings. We may be getting that soon, considering there's the Keefe D trial that is continually being pushed back as new evidence comes about and new information comes to light. I'm really curious to get your thoughts in the comment section as you watch this, as you listen to this. So please do leave me your thoughts in the comments on YouTube. If you're listening to the podcast, search Hidden Killers with Tony Bruschi on YouTube. That's where you will find us. Then that's where you can comment and join in the conversation. This, for me, I've been researching, I've been watching. This is probably like the original true crime case that I have followed since 1996. when I was 1996 would have been about 15, 16, right around there, 14, 15, right around there. I'm not good with math. But in that general area. And maybe it's been a case for you too that you've been following and watching. There are mountains in certain cases where the evidence doesn't hit you like a headline. It hits you like a slow, steady pulse. A thump under the floorboards. That's been there the whole time. Ignored, dismissed, forgotten, until someone finally digs deep enough to rip the boards up and show everyone what's been living underneath. And in the new documentary about Sean Diddy Combs, this sprawling, ugly excavation of violence, intimidation, power, and the shadows of hip-hop history, that pulse is a stack of journals. Literal, like journals. 30 boxes of them. Handwritten by a man most people forgot. Kirk Burroughs is his name. Not a rival, not a disgruntled hanger-on. A co-founder of Bad Boy Entertainment. A man who ran Diddy's budgets, approved his expenses, managed his money, and witnessed the movement of people, cars, weapons, and influence at the precise time when Tupac Shakur and the Notorious B.I.G. were murdered. You don't get a paper trail from the underbelly of hip-hop. You don't get ledgers from the streets. You don't get logs from gang meetings or receipts for million-dollar bounties. That world operates in shadows, whispers, fear, and sudden violence. But you do get journals like this from a man like Kirk Burroughs, a man whose entire job was to keep track of every dollar and every movement, not because he thought he'd one day be a witness, because he was the only person in the room who wasn't allowed to forget anything. And those journals, for the first time, are out in the open. They don't give us a smoking gun. They give us a map of jealousy, a map of fear, a map of sudden money movements that make no logistical sense, a map of gang proximity, relation logic, and a pattern of violence that somehow kept circling the same man while his rivals ended up dead, his friends ended up silenced, and his critics ended up erased. This isn't about proving murder. This is about a pattern. A pattern that stretches from the East Coast-West Coast feud straight through the federal investigations Diddy had been facing. A pattern that starts with two of the biggest murders in music history and winds through decades of allegations about abuse, intimidation, retaliation, and the use of violence, not as chaos, but as currency. So let's start where the documentary picks this up, with the journals. Imagine boxes stacked to the ceiling. Mead notebooks, scribbled margins, dates pinned like coordinates. Not dramatic notes about conspiracies or confessions. No, these are the mundane mechanics of a man who handled the money, rental cars, budgets, travel plans, hotel blocks, flight changes, personal expenses, and the kind of daily logistics you only notice because they're not supposed to stand out. And then you see him. The entries tied to August and September of 1996, the weeks leading into Tupac Shakur's murder, car rentals, multiple rentals, long-distance travel expenses for a trip Diddy did not need to take by road, movements that put key players in the exact corridor that police and gang witnesses have talked about for years, movements that align with allegations, not prove them, but align eerily close. In those weeks, Dwayne Keefe D. Davis, a prominent Southside Crip and longtime figure in the Tupac murder investigation, claims Diddy made a broad public statement in a room full of Crips that he'd give anything to see Tupac and Suge Knight gone. Keefe D. claims there was talk of $1 million bounty. Now, whether we take his word is another conversation. His credibility has been attacked and defended by investigators for decades, but what you cannot dispute is that his timeline is now backed unintentionally by the journals of the man who controlled Diddy's finances at the time. Burroughs' notes don't say, "This is for the hit." Of course they don't. That's not how this world works. Nor does Burroughs claim to have any knowledge of this is what was the plan. But they do show this. Diddy suddenly wanted to drive to Las Vegas from New York weeks before the Tyson fight. Drive. Something totally out of character for a man who flew everywhere. That ain't a quick drive for those of you playing along with the world of geography. And the man allegedly carrying the murder weapon, Eric Von Zip Martin, a Harlem drug lord with deep ties to Diddy, and a man Burroughs was told was Diddy's uncle, suddenly had a concealed compartment in his vehicle that Keefe D says held the gun used to kill Tupac. When law enforcement, gang witnesses, and financial logs all line up in the same 72-hour window, you don't get proof, you get a pattern. A pattern, powerful enough to reopen investigations, change public perception, and expose what insiders have whispered for nearly 30 years. Here's what else journals reveal, or more accurately, what they confirm. Diddy was jealous, deeply jealous of Tupac and Biggie's friendship. That's the allegation. Most people remember the public beef, the theatrics, the diss tracks, but inside Bad Boy, according to Burroughs and multiple others, the problem was simpler and darker. Diddy hated that Biggie had a friend he didn't control. He hated that Pac and Biggie's bond wasn't built on branding or manipulation or image. It was built on actual respect. It was organic. It was theirs. And if you're going, wait a second, they weren't friends. Oh, but they were. The minutia, the information, the rivalry, the anger, the diss tracks, all of that happened at the very tail end of each of their lives. Prior to that, they were friends. They were. They'd hang out. There was times where Biggie opened for Tupac. I know, it sounds crazy because when you look back at history, you get stuck into compartmentalized zones of this is what the truth is. This is what life was like. At the end, yes, because that's where everyone focuses. But for the majority, the actual life being lived for nearly a decade, that wasn't the case. They respected each other. They supported each other. They showed up to each other's promotions, parties. They promoted each other. They respected each other. What changed? What made all of that different? Well, enter Sean Puffy Combs. And allegations, assumptions, rumors, and actions. Not the actions that I would say necessarily put a gun in Puffy's hand, but certainly a jealousy of a relationship that he was not part of, between two very talented men that he was not one of. And what do people with, say, narcissistic tendencies tend to do when their ego is so fragile and others are outshining them? Well, they destroy. They destroy anything in the way that is hurting that ego. And if what's being hurt is a relationship between who he wants to be viewed as being best friends with, because that was, of course, the story after death, that they were tight. They were just the best of friends. They were best buddies. History tells us something very different about the relationship with Biggie and Diddy. It was all a dream. The man obsessed with image, perception, and power. This relationship with Tupac and Biggie was unforgivable, allegedly. Burroughs describes a version of Diddy that has since been echoed by ex-bodyguards, former artists, and even industry executives. A man who needed to be the center of every room, whose fear of losing control often mutated into rage, paranoia, and dangerous decisions made in the heat of ego. He says, for Sean, being a marketer, you're a manipulator. Not metaphorically, literally. Manipulation wasn't a tactic, it was the whole operating system. And if you apply that lens to the timeline surrounding Pac and Biggie's death, the whole thing starts to look less like random tragedy and more like the aftermath of a man whose fear, jealousy, and ego kept putting powerful, violent people into close proximity with each other. Which brings us to the murder of Biggie Smalls, 6 months after Tupac. Another drive-by, another retaliation, another case with no arrest, no closure, and no accountability. Former LAPD Detective Greg Kading, who investigated both murders, including under the federal task force, has long maintained that Biggie's death looks like retaliation for Tupac, a counterstrike, but not necessarily ordered by Suge Knight. In fact, Kading says something that hits like a brick towards the end of the documentary. It's really Keefe D and Puffy Combs who are the last men standing. Think about that. Of all the gang figures, producers, executives, and affiliates who lived through that era, the only two men still alive who sat at the center of the violence are a Southside Crip and Sean Diddy Combs. And Diddy has denied every allegation outright. Aggressively, repeatedly, and consistently. But denial doesn't erase pattern. Denial doesn't erase proximity, and denial does not erase journals. Keefe D's proffer session, played in the documentary, adds another layer. It's not a confession in the legal sense. It's a proffer, meaning what he said can't be used against him, but it can be used to build out context, timelines, investigative lead sheets, and supporting evidence. In that session, he describes Diddy making a public statement about wanting Suge and Tupac dead. He describes Zip transporting the weapon. He describes the Crips preparing for the night of the Tyson fight. And when you look at Burroughs' journals again, the strange car rentals, the quick turn travel plans, the confusing instructions that made no sense to him at the time. What Burroughs saw as odd in 1996 suddenly makes sense in 2025 when you have gang witnesses, law enforcement investigators, and decades of insider accounts telling you that powerful men move differently when they're afraid or when they want something to happen without leaving fingerprints. But the journals don't just illuminate the murders. They illuminate the culture around Diddy, a culture that looks unsettlingly similar to the allegations we're hearing today. Burroughs says sometimes you're humiliated, sometimes you're made an example of, sometimes violent things happen to you. Understand that. Let that settle. This is a man who worked inside Diddy's life, not just his company. A man who controlled the budget, saw the movements, watched the power dynamics unfold in real time. And he's telling you calmly, directly, with decades of hindsight, that violence was a management style. Intimidation wasn't the exception. It was an everyday language. And why the current allegations, the raids, the civil suits, the trafficking claims, the whispers about federal charges don't feel like a shocking new chapter. They feel like the same book. The murders of Tupac and Biggie may not have been orchestrated by Diddy, and the documentary doesn't accuse him of that directly. It can't. There's no conclusive evidence, but it does show through the journals, the proffer tapes, the testimonies, and the unraveling of the East Coast, West Coast timeline is that Diddy was not a passive bystander. He was not an innocent spectator caught in the crossfire of something bigger than him. He was sitting in the center of the storm with the money, with the fear, with the ego, with the connections, and with the kind of psychological volatility that can make a feud turn fatal even if you never pull the trigger. People forget this, but in the months before Biggie's death, Bad Boy was renegotiating his contract. Burroughs says Diddy wanted to swap pages, a quiet internal rewrite that would have benefited the company. He wanted to do this. After Biggie died. Diddy had already signed the contract. And in a contract, there are terms. There's multiple pages. This page, that page, this page. Sign here at the very end. Typically, today, a lot of the standard is initial each page to prevent something like this from happening. The allegation is that after Biggie died, the agreement that he had with Bad Boy Records, he wanted to adjust, amend, make it something that Biggie did not sign. So Bad Boy would basically be more financially benefited by the agreement, the financial gains of the music of the now deceased Biggie Smalls. So that less would basically go to his estate, to whoever would be collecting on the behalf of Biggie. change that up. He's dead. You know, like you do when your friends die. Let's find a way to go back in time, and I think I can make more money off of him when he's dead. He won't need this. Let's change the terms up here. That's the allegation. What Burroughs says Sean Diddy Combs wanted to do to the music agreement, to the profit agreement with Biggie and his estate. Burroughs refused to change the papers up. He refused to put the new edited copies inside the folder with the end-signed page by Christopher Wallace, Biggie Smalls, with the new, more generous pages designed to benefit Bad Boy and Diddy. Burroughs refused. 90 days later, fired. And Biggie was dead. And suddenly, the contract Diddy wanted is no longer up for debate. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe it's another example of a man who understood the power of timing and the power of silence. Because what happens to people who cross Diddy? In Burroughs' case, blacklisted for 25 years, shelters, homelessness, gone. You don't achieve that level of erasure by accident. You achieve it with influence, intimidation, and a network of people who know the consequences of speaking publicly. The documentary doesn't prove Diddy killed Tupac. It doesn't prove he had Biggie murdered. It doesn't claim that. What it does show you is a pattern, a decades-long pattern of fear, control, violence, proximity to gang warfare, egomaniacal decision-making, secretive money movements, and a chilling ability to walk away from disasters that destroyed everyone around him. Tupac died, Biggie died, Zip disappeared, and most of the gang leaders are gone. Investigators have retired, witnesses have been killed, silenced, or discredited, and the only two men who remain in the frame, the only two still standing, Keefy D and Diddy. And right now, one of them has already started talking. And the other one, he's watching decades of silence collapse under the weight of 30 boxes of journals that were never supposed to see the light of day. This isn't a murder accusation. This is a pattern recognition, a recognition that every time violence erupted, every time power shifted, every time rivals fell, every time lives were destroyed, Diddy'd walk away larger, richer, and more feared and more untouchable. Patterns aren't proof. But when the pattern is big enough, long enough, and dark enough, people stop asking Diddy and start asking, how could he have not known? The documentary doesn't tell you what to think. It just finally puts the map on the table. And once you look at it, all the lines start pointing in the same place. Again, give me your thoughts in the comment section on YouTube. If you're not already there, search Hidden Killers with Tony Bruschi. Be sure to hit subscribe while you are there as well. We're trying to get up to 100,000 subscribers by the end of the year. We'll see if we make it. We're getting close. We're getting up there. But with your help, if you enjoy our commentaries and our coverage of the many cases we follow for you, please do us a favor and hit subscribe. You're doing yourself a favor, too, because then you're going to get updates on all these cases as we put them out for you every single day right here at the Hidden Killers Podcast and True Crime Today. My name is Tony Bruschi. We will talk again real.
Want more on this case and others? Then press subscribe now and don't miss a moment of true crime coverage from Tony Bruschi and the Hidden Killers Podcast.